Hello, I'm Kamal Santamaria. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, affordable housing. The haves and the have-nots. From Hong Kong to London, we question whether governments are doing enough to provide housing for their growing urban populations. Also this week, Russia and the man who could stand against Vladimir Putin and spent 10 years in prison for his political ambitions. Mikhail Khodorkovsky tells us Russia could be heading towards an economic crisis, maybe even an uprising. And we take a wander through the art gallery with the auction house Sotheby's as it brings international and Middle Eastern art to the Gulf. Something about the protests in Hong Kong got us thinking this past week. Yes, it's all been about democracy, but dig a little deeper and the demographics reveal a whole haves and have-nots issue bubbling away. And it's something replicated all over the world. People are being priced out of the housing market. It's as simple as that. In fact, according to the consultancy firm McKinsey, a shortage of affordable housing means 1.6 billion people are having to make some pretty tough choices between where they live and the basics like food, education and healthcare. It would cost $11 trillion to build and replace that appropriate affordable housing, leading McKinsey to suggest governments should do more to sell off land at below market prices. Now, that'd probably make sense in a place like Hong Kong, but instead, parcels of land there are being sold off to the highest bidders, mostly well-connected property empires. Where does that leave everyone else? Let's start this week with this report from Adrian Brown.
Hong Kong is one of the world's richest cities, but it doesn't seem that way in the working-class district of Sham Shui Po. Tang Sheng is 82 and spends each day collecting cardboard to recycle. On a good day, he can make $8. His young daughter is the main breadwinner, making around $1,300 a month. But that disqualifies Tung from welfare, and so every cent now counts.
Life is miserable. No one feels pity for us. We're on our own, and we have to live a more frugal life.
Nearby, two children are returning home after school. Zhu Jailin is 11, her brother Zhu Yaoji almost 7. And this is where they've lived for the past 3 years. A room measuring less than 8 square meters. It's a subdivided apartment. Kitchen, bedroom, bathroom, study area, and no privacy.
We do not have enough money to live on. Half of what we receive goes on rent. On top of that, we have to pay utilities. It's a real struggle.
He Li Shen is from China, but can't work here. That's because she's now separated from her Hong Kong partner, which means she can't apply for citizenship. She can remain in the city because her children were born here, but they can't apply for public housing.
I feel helpless. Before I came to Hong Kong, I did not understand sayings like hell on earth or life is no longer worth living. Now I know what those feelings mean.
The government admits more than 170,000 people now live this way, a third of them migrants from the mainland, adding to the demand on public housing. This city's wealth gap is one of the biggest in the world, and the lack of affordable housing is another reason for the discontent here. People also complain that public utilities, transport systems, telecommunications, and even supermarkets are all in the hands of a wealthy elite who also dominate the property sector.
Young people are saying they can't buy a house, they can't even rent a house because rent has become, totally unaffordable. And therefore they have a hard time getting married, and even after they get married they cannot have children because there's no room for it.
Hong Kong boasts one of the world's freest economies. This week it announced that its foreign currency reserves stood at more than $325 billion. But that's unlikely to make much difference to the life of Tang Sheng and so many others like him.
So what do some governments do to combat all this? Well, in mainland China, Beijing pumped billions into a property boom to save itself from the North Atlantic financial crisis back in 2008. But that boom led to a bursting of the bubble, raising fears about debt. In fact, the Financial Times reported one property developer in Nanning was so desperate to get people interested, it offered 1,000 live chickens to people who bought their apartments. Now, full disclosure here, those weren't the actual chickens in question. Our producer Aisha managed to find those pictures of chickens on a Chinese construction site for illustrative purposes. But, you know, think about other places too. This is Dubai. Saw prices plunge 60%. But property fever's back and raising concerns. And in the UK as well, the Bank of England insisted on new affordability measures to curb house price inflation, which, to be fair, seems to be doing the trick in London. And we're going to talk about that and wider property issues now with our guest, Rob Tinknell, who is the CEO of the Battersea Power Station Development Company. Rob, I basically want to pick your property brain here, and we'll start with the UK, where the Bank of England brought in these measures to limit mortgages. Has that actually curbed the housing bubble, in your opinion? You know, there were concerns amongst property professionals that there was all this money coming in from overseas investors and that it could be tapering off. Is that a concern for you in the end?
We're not seeing anything like that at all in Battersea Power Station, and indeed I don't think it's true in central London. Central London has almost become the international capital of the world, and there's so much investment pouring into central London as people see it as a great safe haven for investment. What that's doing as well is causing perhaps local people to perhaps move slightly out of central London into more fringe city locations, and that in turn is making them even better as urbanisation, etc., is getting better in those places. So
then, even though we're seeing patchy economic growth, not just in London but in plenty of capital cities around the world, you're saying the demand does still stay strong?
Well, last weekend we had a preview weekend for our Phase 3 launch, which is coming up in a couple of weeks. And 1,350 people turned up at an exhibition to have a look at 530 apartments. So the demand seems to be there, and a lot of those people are local as well. 70% of the people who bought in the power station Phase 2 in May of this year were local people, which was tremendous. So we're not seeing any particular signs of a slow up in the market at Battersea.
You know, I don't get it, to be honest, Rob. The more you describe it, the more I'm surprised to see that demand that you talk about. I mean, you'll notice there were unemployment numbers that came out in the UK in the past week, and they were, to be fair, they were a lot better than they have been for a very long time. But still, jobs and everyday needs, these are big concerns, and yet this demand, local demand for property is high.
Well, I think, you know, inflation numbers came out recently that has stabilised thoughts about interest rate rises. So people are less concerned about that. I think there's still a bit of a concern in the UK market about possibilities of legislation changes around mansion tax and things in the run-up to the general election. But in general, we're not seeing that particular problems at Battersea. The froth has definitely come off the market. I mean, it was super growth in last year, but we're now back to what I would call a much more normal level of growth, a much more normal market, which is probably much more sustainable in the long term.
OK, then let's take a step down then from, you know, the top end of properties, the apartments and the houses, and maybe look at this idea that we've got of affordable housing. And again, this is where I want to pick your brain. Do you think governments anywhere in the world are doing enough with regards to affordable housing, social housing, whatever you want to call it, you know, to make sure that people can get into a house, to make sure that those developments, well, that they contribute to the area as well? You know, they actually help bring the infrastructure along, they contribute to the whole of society in that area, as well as getting people into a home.
Well, I think it is a big issue globally, and I think what's happening here in London is actually a really good example. Since becoming mayor, Boris Johnson has created 38 what's called opportunity areas in London. This amounts to nearly 300,000 acres of land. And land where over 500,000 houses is going to get built. There's transport infrastructure being put into these locations, and I think that's exactly what's needed in London. Opening up great swathes of the city, brownfield sites, not previously accessible, and encouraging developers through sensible planning legislation to get on and build more houses for the people in London.
OK, so you're describing there what's being done by a public authority, and that's good. If we flip it and look at the privates, one of the criticism of the private developers, I should say, is that they are, you know, holding back parcels of land, drip feeding what they have and only putting it onto the market when they want. Do you understand that concern, or is it simply that, you are businesses and governments should be legislating?
Well, I think judging by the number of launches that are happening in London over the course of the next 6 months, I don't see any particular evidence of developers holding on to land. What has been the traditional problem in the last few years is actually getting the finance to be able to build it. So pre-sales are really important, getting those sales, and then getting the banks to be able to support developers to be able to get on and build the houses that they've got planning permission and the land for. But that's changing as well. We've just raised over 2.1 billion of construction debt for Battersea Power Station. We're on site now with over 1,500 homes, and we're launching another 500 in the next 2 weeks. So we're not holding back whatsoever. We're getting on with Battersea Power Station finally after 30 years of nothing happening.
True. I'm still wondering about the demand issue though, Rob. And you look at places like, say, here, Doha, Dubai, places where they're just building all the time. And you still, have to remember that the economy is still weak. And maybe I'm belaboring the point here, but I still wonder about that long-term demand.
Well, I think we're still, there's still a lot of countries in the world that have low rates of urbanisation. I think globally now we're about 52% of people around the globe living in cities. But some countries around the world, they're sub 50%, and they've got a bit of catching up to do. Now, what happens there is they're piling into their cities and demand, and there's huge demand and huge growth necessary in those cities. Shanghai was a great example. Over 1 million people moving into Shanghai every year as China's urbanisation took off. So I think that is going to continue to fuel the growth of cities around the world. Urbanisation will continue to grow. I think by 2030 it's forecast to hit 60%. So that is massive demand for our big cities. And what I think we're doing as developers now is we're trying to build much, much better places. I think traditionally in the past, just blocks and blocks and blocks of apartments, that is not the done thing anymore. We need to build proper, integrated, mixed-use developments, and that's exactly what we're trying to do at Battersea.
All right, that's Rob Tinknell talking property with us this week. Rob, thank you for your time. And still ahead on Counting the Cost, we get a bit arty. Sotheby's was in town to auction off its latest and greatest pieces, so I went to take a look and see what it was all worth. That's coming up a little bit later. Now to Russia and the oligarch stripped of his liberty and multi-billion-dollar oil company by President Vladimir Putin, who believes Russia is nearing an economic crisis that could lead to an uprising. Mikhail Khodorkovsky fell foul of Putin when he began meddling in politics. In the end, he spent a decade in prison after being found guilty of tax evasion. Patricia Sabga from Al Jazeera America sat down with Khodorkovsky and asked him whether, given all that's transpired in Ukraine, if he thinks the West has underestimated President Putin.
I doubt that anybody in the West today underestimates Putin. I think that if anything, he's being overestimated because he's being compared to the current leaders of their countries. And none of these leaders have lately manifested any brilliant strategic thinking.
You've said in several interviews is that Putin and Russia could be facing or are vulnerable to a 1917-like moment. Can you explain for our audience exactly what you mean by that?
In 1917, Russia was at a stage where it was seeking victory in the First World War. But at that point, the power had lost authority with the people. And as a result, the people were intolerant of even the slightest mistakes that the power would make. They lacked trust in the authorities, and the reason they lacked the trust was because the authorities were totally corrupt. And as a result of a small temporary shortage of bread deliveries in St. Petersburg, this little incident blew up into a revolution and ultimately even a civil war.
Do Western sanctions make that scenario more or less likely?
Less likely, of course. In 1917, or actually more precisely in 1918, Russian society united in the face of an external threat. Not entirely, but to a significant degree, it did unite. Today, the West is doing much the same thing. The way Russian people perceive it, the West is punishing Russia for daring to pursue an independent foreign policy.
So if not sanctions, then what can the West do to at least encourage some reform in Russia?
For Soviet society, and I do mean Soviet, the West was always important as a model of moral behavior. Soviet people wanted very much for our society to be built differently, more fairly, for human value, or for the value of human life to be higher, for our leaders to be more moral. The more advanced segment of the Soviet population saw this example in the West. This was a significant part of the problem, right up there with making sure that the grocery store shelves were filled with goods. Today, the shops are filled with goods both here and there. But the moral example over the past 20 years has become very blurred. I think it would be useful for the West, not only for Russia's sake, but even for its own sake, to move back a little bit to that previous situation. And of course, to tell the Russian people about this.
What should the West be more concerned about? A crisis outside of Russia, Russian aggression, or a crisis inside Russia?
But you can see that these two are totally interconnected. Putin's aggression outside of Russia creates a situation in Russia where the national chauvinists are on the rise, and that is bringing things closer to a crisis. Seeing his popularity falling in Russia and seeing the rise of the national chauvinists, Putin attempts to take over their agenda for himself by means of external aggression. So the situation is certainly interconnected, and to my great regret, I think we have stepped onto a path of no return. As a result of this, of taking this path, the regime in Russia will be destroyed. What sorts of losses this will bring to Russia and to the whole world is something we all have yet to see.
You are a dissident, but you're also an ex-oligarch, which is a rather hated class in Russia. So how can you convince them? Do you think you can be a legitimate engager, if you will?
I'm not a dissident, and I'm certainly not an oligarch anymore. Dissidents are people who serve an idea and who find the notion of compromise impossible. I believe that compromise is also an idea. A person who has spent 10 years in jail is not an oligarch. So I think I do have some opportunities. They have their limits, of course.
You've been asked about your past role as an oligarch, and you have said that mistakes have been made and that your values have changed. But do you think that you need to publicly atone more for your past actions to gain that legitimacy with reform-minded people in Russia?
I have told my fellow citizens numerous times that one may have made mistakes, but I feel it more important to move on rather than dwell on the past. Repentance is a personal thing. It's not a public thing. If somebody wants a public act of repentance, let them await it from Putin. Those who want to move ahead and do something and make change, I want to work with them.
Finally this week, a bit of art. Now, a few months back, you might remember I filmed a story about Qatar's wealth of art investments. Well, to follow up on that and to see just how much ongoing interest there is in art in this part of the world, I went to a Sotheby's contemporary art auction here this week. And the prices, like the art, were pretty impressive. My guide for the day was Sotheby's Middle East director, Lena Lazar. So, Lena, we're standing here looking at any number of pieces which could be from any part of the world, and I guess that's the important thing now, that even though we're in Doha and we're looking at Middle Eastern art and international art, it's all together.
Absolutely, that's the beauty of this exhibition. We are now almost like playing a trick on our viewer and trying to, place the works in an interesting way that really doesn't very much allow for anyone to create a distinction as to what is from where and how.
So let's start with these two pieces over here then, which you were telling me about earlier. The one on the left, the large streamline.
Absolutely, that's a Forces of Nature painting by Lucian Smith, who's this really, really hot and up and coming LA-based artist that we're very excited to have for the first time in Doha. So that's a very quite an exciting work.
And because we're on an economics and a business program, I've got to talk numbers. What are you hoping for something like that?
To give you an idea, this is priced at $80,000 to $100,000, but this is something that in normal days in London or New York would fetch about $200,000 easy.
Right.
Easy. So the estimates are very conservative, and for us the idea was really to try and kind of promote locally the visibility of these younger, up-and-coming, maybe Western artists in the GCC. And the next to it it's called The Chase by Ali Benisadr, who's this really, really hot young Iranian artist. He's based in New York. He's working in New York. He was trained in the US as well. But to give you a sense of the value and perspective to things, this is an artist who would have sold perhaps in the last maybe 18 months to 2 years for anywhere between $40,000 and $60,000 mark. We're offering this specific work, which is a very, very strong example, and possibly the best one to ever come up at auction, at $180,000 to $250,000. And quite frankly, I would be very, very surprised if the work sold within that estimate.
What sort of time frame is that increase coming over?
Oh, in the last 2 years, the big
quickly,
jump, very,
okay.
very quickly. But this specific work will sell for a lot more than the estimates, for sure.
Lena, this is one of those moments where I look at it and say, I don't know
what you're looking at, huh?
Well,
it's very overwhelming.
It is. Tell me, Anish Kapoor, for instance.
Anish Kapoor, this is a work we're so excited to have here because, as part of that ongoing dialogue I was telling you about earlier, we're very keen on being very specific with the sort of work by international and Western artists we're bringing here. So in this context, Anish Kapoor is obviously one of the most incredible sculptors of our time. He's originally from India, practicing in London, and he's a world-renowned artist. But in this context of the sale, we thought, if we're going to bring any dish by Anish Kapoor is, nice, but what would be really even nicer is to be able to be in a position to bring something with a cultural reference to the place we're exhibiting the work in. And this series is heavily inspired by Islamic art, and the whole idea of the pixelation being inspired by the Islamic tiles, ceramics, and mosaics, exactly. So this work made even more sense here, which is the reason why. But can you tell me?
Yeah, well, okay. I don't want to be capitalist about it, but put a price tag on this for me, or what you're expecting.
We're expecting this work is priced at $700,000 to $900,000, but it is incredibly well, priced in the sense that a work like this would sell normally and on a normal day for anywhere between $1.2 to $1.4 million. So we're being very conservative. We're trying to really make it, approachable and accessible. Yes, absolutely.
So then you were telling me about modern masters being on show here, and that kind of leads me to this very basic idea that this is where the money is, the Middle East, and therefore that's why a group like Sotheby's is here. Things have dipped away in Europe and the United States over the last few years, so you come here.
I'd like to say that this could be an interesting way of looking at it, and it's probably the usual simplistic kind of understanding of what it is that we're trying to do, but absolutely not. Honestly, the market couldn't be stronger right now than London and New York. With Frieze coming up, we've seen incredible potential sales happening next week. The sales are very, very strong. And there's no recession in the art market at the moment, absolutely not. And so being here in Doha is really it's a much more in-depth, strategy for us of really bringing the best of Middle Eastern and Western to the region. And it has a much stronger educational component, I'd like to say. So it's really, over the last 8 years, we tried to create that, stronger understanding of the market.
Right. And how interested are international investors in Middle Eastern art?
Well, so far we've had, very good interest. The last 8 years our sales have been growing. Last year, as you know, we've had the world record sale for a Middle Eastern contemporary art auction with reaching over $15 million of sales. So it was, we're getting there. There's definitely an interest both from institutions and everyday collectors. And, the market is slowly building up. So it's very exciting to be here at this time of year.
And you saw some of the final prices appearing on screen there during that report. The whole auction achieved over $8 million in sales, which was at the upper end of expectations, with record prices for 13 different artists. So, Not a bad day's work, I guess. That is our show for this week, but there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/programs. The Counting the Cost page is there with individual reports, links and entire episodes to catch up on. The social media feed is down the right-hand side as well, with people's comments and feedback, which you can join in by tweeting either me at KamalAJE or our business editor at Abid Oliver Ali. You can get on the feed by using the hashtag Counting the Cost, or just email us. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is the address. But that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Kamal Santamaria from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.